Hey, welcome to Tantrums and Tabletops. I'm Russ Sheath. Today I'm talking to Brian Hickey from Total Toy Books about his exciting new project called Battle Action Force Treasury Editions. This project reprints some classic British comic books that haven't been seen for almost 40 years. And if you're a fan of G.I. Joe or Action Man, then you'll want to listen to this interview because this is exactly what you need in your life. Enjoy the interview. Check out the project. I'll see you soon. Brian Hickey, welcome to Tantrums and Tabletops. It's a real thrill to have you here. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great, Russ. Thanks so much for getting me on to have a chat and talking about one of my favourite subjects, which is Palitoy's Action Force and the comics.
100%. I've been so looking forward to this ever since we first connected. So we're here, folks, to talk about Action Force and specifically your upcoming project, which I'll let you talk about because you explain it so much better than I do. Tell us about this upcoming Action Force project. Isn't it? It's not upcoming, it's live, it's available now, and why we're here to talk today.
So my company is Total Toy Books, and I've got a license to reprint a selection of Action Force stories from Battle Action Force in three oversized limited edition Treasury Edition volumes. So that collects pretty much the stories from 1983 and 84 that wrap up the kind of the Baron Ironblood and his Red Shadows continuity. So it kicks off with the very first Action Force story from June 1983 and runs right through to the final events before Baron Ironblood converts to Cobra Commander. So
that's really interesting. You mentioned Cobra Commander, which for people less familiar with Battle Action Force and what Battle Action Force is, they might well know the name Cobra Commander from, of course, G.I. Joe. So let's just take a little step back there, Brian. Let's talk about exactly what Battle Action Force was and then how you're bringing that to new audiences.
So we'll roll back even to before Battle Action Force. We had just Battle, which was a comic produced by Fleetway or IPC magazines, and it was a kind of a war stories comic that had a reputation for being pretty, grim, tough, not pulling its punches when it came to the action or the storytelling. It was it was a much grittier war comic than some of the competitors that were on the market at that time. Deliberately set up like that to kind of set it apart from its competitors. So after a few, by the early 1980s, when Palitoy had put their Action Force line out in the market, they wanted to find a comic partner that would bring their kind of Action Force universe to life. And they initially looked at Marvel UK. In 1982, they were talking to Marvel UK to see if they could get a kind of a comic tie-in going at that stage. But their PR company had connections within IPC, and they knew that IPC had bigger distribution. They had a much higher sales than what Marvel UK had at that time. So ultimately Palitoy partnered with IPC or Fleetway, which was the trading name, to do a comic tie-in for the Action Force toys, and that went into it could have gone into any comic really that IPC were doing, but they bundled it in with Battle, and they previewed Action Force in a small story serialized in 4 parts, a total of 12 pages over 4 issues. That was followed up by 5 mini comics, which I think there was only maybe 6 or 7 story pages in those mini comics. There was 5 of those, and that was all in the summer of 1983. And then by October 1983, the Action Force stories became a permanent fixture in the comic Battle, and the comic was rebranded to Battle Action Force. And the Action Force content, I think it was 16 out of 32 pages. So the ambition, both from Palitoy's side and with IPC or Fleetway, was to really create a very serious universe for the Action Force toys within the pages of the comic. So they put together a pretty impressive team of heavyweights, both on the writing side and on the art side. And they created this very rich universe, which ran for 3 whole years. So these 3 new Treasury Edition volumes collect the first 2 years, or say just over a year and a half of content.
And it's interesting. Let's just talk a little bit about the Action Force toy line a second, and this is where you can jump in and correct me if I'm wrong. So in the US, you had G.I. Joe, the 12-inch iteration, which came around in, let's say, the 1950s, late 50s, early 60s, if that's about right.
Mid-60s, 64, 65, I think it was. 64, I think it was.
And Hasbro in the US licensed that G.I. Joe 12-inch, America's Fighting Man type figure all around the world. They licensed him to Japan, and in the UK they licensed him to Palitoy, if that's correct.
Yep.
Yeah. But because the name didn't quite sit so well, G.I. Joe didn't quite work so well outside of the US, Palitoy rebranded the 12-inch G.I. Joe figure and called him Action Man, which might be a name that maybe some of our US audiences might be familiar with because it's come up time and again kind of later on. Now, Action Force is the kind of effectively the shrunk-down version of Action Man. Is that oversimplifying things?
That is exactly what it is, 100%. So you have obviously the success of Star Wars and its 3 3/4 inch figures. Neither Hasbro nor Palitoy could ignore that success. They could see the trend in the market going for the smaller action figure size, and there were economic, reasons to scale things down too. So they, on the Palitoy side of it, they literally, they initially explored a whole different kind of series of options of what Action Force could be, but ultimately the decision was made was just copy our top 12 best-selling Action Man uniforms. And that first wave of Action Force that was released in 1982 is mini Action Man in 3 3/4 inch scale. So literally that's what it was. And then there was a second wave which came out later in 1982. I think there was maybe 4 or 5 additional figures in that first iteration of Action Force, and they maybe introduced something a little bit different from the typical Action Man line. But it wasn't until 1983 that the Action Force that's kind of covered in the comics that was developed.
And that's quite interesting because... Sorry, Brian, go ahead.
No, I'm going off on my Action Force. I'll give you the whole history. I better slow it down a bit and break it up into questions.
So the line evolved from being effectively, as you said, a shrunk-down version of Action Man, which is an alternative name for the 12-inch G.I. Joe figure, and the 12 best-selling uniforms. There was no narrative behind it. They were just basically sort of Star Wars articulated action figure versions of toy soldiers.
Correct. Yes, and for people who maybe aren't aware, you see, outside of the UK, Palitoy were manufacturing Star Wars toys. They had the license from Kenner to do the British market, and in fact, they would ultimately go on to be responsible for all of Europe, the distribution of Star Wars toys. So that Star Wars, 5 POA, sonic welded action figure. That's what they knew how to make. They did actually do some market testing, because there were other articulated figures on the market at that time. I mean, we're talking about a time here before G.I. Joe was released, before Action Force was released. Mego had articulated figures, with the 9 POA. So Palitoy would have been aware of those other types of figures on the market, but when they actually, and this is a piece of information that myself and Bob Breakin uncovered during the design process for My Palitoy Story, which is Bob Breakin's History of Palitoy book. And for people who don't know, Bob was the head designer at Palitoy in the 70s and 80s. But so we found an article in a Palitoy newsletter where they talk about going to market testing to see if kids preferred articulated or less articulated action figures. And what they found was that they actually had no preference. The kids, their imagination filled in the gaps, and that they were just as happy playing with the Star Wars style 5 POA or the Mego style 9 POA figures. So because Palitoy knew that they already had the manufacturing process set up for 5 POA figures, they just said, well, let's go with that. It would save time and it would save money, and they were under pressure to rush something out to Toy Fair for January 1982. Little did they know that at the same time in America, they were developing their G.I. Joe 9 POA line. So in 1982 Toy Fair in January in Britain, Palitoy revealed Action Force, and then only a few weeks later Hasbro revealed G.I. Joe. And it was at that point that both companies became aware of what each company was doing in the 3 3/4 inch market. And of course Hasbro knew that Palitoy, I mean, they were a client of Hasbro's because of the licensing of the 12-inch G.I. Joe. They immediately got in contact and said, would you license our 3 3/4 inch G.I. Joe? So this is all within, maybe a month or two of both of these toy lines being revealed in 1982. So Palitoy said yes, they would take some of the G.I. Joe material, mainly the vehicles, but the clause was it had to fit with their own universe. They were going to create their own universe for Action Force. So internally, the design and marketing team started to look at ways of how they could develop a mythology and create different kind of factions, good guys versus bad guys. And they initially looked at something that was a bit more kind of science fiction fantasy, but ultimately what kind of won out was going for a more modern military look and feel. So while we did get Space Force in the Action Force lineup, this is what we would call the Series 2, the second iteration of Action Force. We've got the Space Force team, we've got the Q Force team, and even to some degree the Enemy team all have a bit of a sci-fi fantasy feel to them. But the biggest teams are SAS Force and Z Force, which look like modern military figures. They brought in the Hasbro vehicles to flesh out mainly SAS Force and Z Force, but they needed to also bring some G.I. Joe figures to fit as vehicle drivers, because the 5 POA figures didn't always sit neatly or snugly into the Hasbro vehicles. So that's really how Hasbro and Palitoy kind of joined forces to give us the Action Force that's really is what people remember today.
And that's really interesting, because even though we're here to talk about your books and the Battle Action Force project, at times the storylines in the comic very much interweave, and there's a lot of connectivity there with going from a very Action Force orientated, like we talked about, Z Force, SAS Force, the Red Shadows, Baron Ironblood, and then more into an Action Force, but with G.I. Joe characters that, let's say, audiences in the US, for example, would very much recognise, but with their own particular Action Force twist to them, still under the IPC banner. So let's remain focused on your project and the Battle Action Force books. So your effort is to collect and reprint those original IPC early 1980s comics. Is that a kind of fair, kind of in a nutshell assessment?
I mean, that's a pretty, you pretty summed it up right there, nice and neatly. There's a lot of content was produced in that 83, 84 era. So this is very much the Palitoy Action Force era, and the stories focus, they're collected in these 3 volumes, focus on what I call the principal continuity. So we have the very first story is like the invasion of Vicenity Island by Baron Ironblood and the Red Shadows, and they hold the United Nations to ransom, threatening to blow up the island and essentially murder the local population. And then that leads into Operation Bloodhound. I'm kind of skipping now, really quickly through the continuity, where again it's set in South America, and Action Force are kind of pursuing Baron Ironblood, kind of to try and track him down. Ultimately, the Red Shadows exit South America and move initially to Asia and then ultimately to Europe. And then some of the final kind of battles take place in Europe before we move into what we call the Cobra Commander era. So, I mean, I'm skipping a lot of detail in that very kind of quick capsule summary there, but that's essentially the continuity that's captured in those 3 volumes. So there are some amazing backstory or character backstories that were also released in that same time period. They won't be collected in these particular volumes. That's something that I would love to see collected separately, like an Origins type volume, maybe at some point in the future, and there would be brilliant stories that could be collected into that. So these 3 volumes would give you very linear kind of emergence of Baron Arbor and the Red Shadows up to their what we call their final missions, for want of a better term. That's the best way I can describe it. But there are character data files included in the volumes as well. These are, compared to your G.I. Joe, the G.I. Joe action figures, you got the file cards on the back of on the card back. We did get that to some degree with the Action Force toys as well, but they made a bigger deal out of it in the comics. You got lovely art, lovely illustrative pieces for the characters, maybe a little bit more expansion on the bio for them. So that they were, all of the Action Force, the unique original Action Force characters all got a data file in the comic. So they're going to be collected in these 3 volumes. So if you're new to kind of Battle Action Force, this is a great piece of content to include to get familiar with the characters. And of course, if you're a long-term fan, it brings all of those data files together in a nice kind of collection. There was also printed in the comics at the time a series of what were called combat reports, and they featured a beautiful piece of artwork, usually by someone like Carmona or one of the Spanish artists, Raymond, or one of them. Beautiful artwork, and then maybe a short narrative piece, maybe 250 words. So they're going to be collected into the volumes too, just to get that beautiful artwork in it, reprinted and out there again.
So what I thought I would do is I'm going to hold up, and it might not look great on the camera, but here's a copy of Battle Action Force from 1985. And I think it's really interesting to point out to folks watching this is we've got a very much a sort of a newsprint quality comic book, which was very much prevalent in kind of UK comics at the time, certainly away from Marvel UK, where you had newsprint. Also, the size and the format for comparison, here's a copy of G.I. Joe. And you can see the size difference between the 2 formats there, just holding them up next to each other. And, as we know with newsprint and those newsprint quality comics, comics such as the Eagle 2000 AD, they all appeared in this kind of very similar format, didn't they?
Yes.
And, they don't hold up to aging in the years very well. So what you've been doing with your Battle Action Force project is restoring that work and bringing it back to its kind of original printed glory. And in fact, I would say remastering it and actually taking it beyond how it appeared in newsprint. Can you tell us a bit about that kind of restorative work that you've been undertaking?
Oh yeah, that's that's been the biggest focus for me on this project over the last few months is that restoration work. So so what I'm scanning, I've got a complete collection of the comics. I'm scanning from the comics, and my comics are in pretty good nick, but the nature of that newsprint that you described there, even if you really looked after it in a because the paper is of such a low quality, it's going to degrade anyway. It'll discolor, it'll become more brittle. It's almost impossible to keep it kind of mint. So I'm scanning each page, super high res, and then going in there and meticulously cleaning up every single page, every single blemish and every single panel. And it's a meticulous, it's a detailed kind of process. It's a very lengthy process, but it's also very rewarding because this is artwork that I love. You know, I've got a very strong nostalgic connection to these stories and to these comics. So it's great to see it come together. And you know, if I get like really technical just for a little bit, the comics are actually fourth generation reproduction of the artwork. So what I mean by that is when the artist, you know, with pencil and ink up the artboard, that's the first generation. Then that would have to be converted. This is in 1982, 83. That would be converted to a piece of film in order to make a print plate. So that piece of film would be the second generation. And then the print plate made off the film is a third generation. And then that's printed onto the newsprint, which is a fourth generation reproduction of the artwork. So what I'm then, when I scan that and have to clean that up, I have to be very respectful of the artwork and mindful that I'm working from a source material that's three generations away from the original artwork. So it has to be very high res. It has to be meticulously and lovingly restored, so that we can get a beautiful print in these new editions that looks comparable to the comics that everybody remembers. So it you know, it comes with a lot of responsibility, and again, the artwork has to be treated with a lot of respect.
And it's an absolute labour of love as well. As a fan who's not only just working on pulling the project together and restoring the artwork, but who actually went to the lengths to untangle the licensing and the ownership behind the various iterations of Action Force to be able to put it together and make the project possible in the first instance. Let's just talk about that and your kind of passion for Action Force. What was it about Action Force back when you were a wee lad that kind of connected with you and that stayed with you for all these years?
Oh wow! Well, okay, that's a good one. That's a good question. I mean, okay, so I would have been, you know, growing up in the 70s. I would have been familiar with, say, I would have had like plastic soldiers. They would have been kind of the toy that I would have known most kind of growing up. And I have a very specific, very vivid memory that my dad would occasionally, as a treat, he would take me and my brother to this shop that sold the Airfix soldiers, you know, the 1 to 32 scale soldiers. I was like 5, my brother was 3. And we would refer to it as like, we're going to get a box of soldiers, because the Airfix, they came in a box. You had the beautiful artwork on the front of the box. And if you're not, if anyone watching this isn't familiar with Airfix, you can just do a quick Google, and the artwork is just stunning on that packaging. So the kind of military toys is something that is what I would have known as a kid. The Star Wars Action Man is a toy I would have had as well. Kind of growing up, and then when the Star Wars films came out, and then subsequently the toys came out, that was kind of my go-to, the Star Wars toys. But I always loved that kind of more modern military, characters, and even the style of kind of modern military, like the uniforms, the colorings, things like that. So when Action Force came onto my radar, which would have been in 1983, they were giving away a free Action Force figure with Battle. And I think Eagle and Tiger might have also had free Action Force figures as part of that promotion. They were all IPC titles. That really impressed me. Seeing a figure that was of the same size and articulation of Star Wars, but that had all the kind of the colouring of modern military and the accessories. Plus, the Action Force figures, they had the arms, one of the arms was bent so they could hold their rifle with 2 hands, which the Star Wars figures couldn't do. So that kind of level of, in terms of how you could pose the figures, that appealed to me even more than the Star Wars stuff. So it was an instant hit with me as soon as I discovered it. That kind of passion is sort of, it's always kind of stayed with me. Even, when I kind of drifted out of collecting as I got a bit older, when I kind of returned to collecting in the kind of mid-2000s, I went after kind of Action Force stuff, and vintage Star Wars and vintage Action Force is what I went after. And this particular project that we're talking about now, the Treasury editions, this actually has its roots in the COVID lockdown. I had pulled out my Battle Action Force comics. I was rereading them during lockdown, and what I noticed was, which kind of went over my head as a kid, that the main writer was a guy called Jerry Finley Day, and Jerry Finley Day is a legend in British comics. So he's, and he created, he's most famous for creating Rogue Trooper, but he created a whole host of other brilliant titles and stories that featured in Battle and 2000 AD and other comics that were printed at that time. He's our Jerry Day, or he's our Larry Hama. So if Larry Hama is the godfather of the G.I. Joe comics, Jerry Finley Day is the godfather of the Action Force comics. So, I really wanted to spotlight. I'm aware of, say, how collectors, G.I. Joe collectors, they're so familiar with Larry Hama. They talk about him at the drop of a hat. They're really familiar with all of his work. And I never saw the same kind of enthusiasm or knowledge from Action Force collectors for Jerry Finley Day. So I wanted to address that, and I came up with an idea for a book all about Action Force that told the story of the toys and of the tie-in comics from that time period. And that book was called Total Action Force: The Battle Years. And that was funded through Kickstarter back into 2021. And to get that book looking the way I wanted it to look, I had to get a license and permission from Hasbro and Rebellion to include the comic artwork in that book. So that kind of ultimately, in a kind of very to make a long story short, that ultimately led to getting a new license, or an expanded license, to be able to reprint the comics that we're seeing now in these volumes 1, 2, and 3 for the Treasury editions.
And what's really interesting in that, so we've talked a bit about the Treasury editions of 3 volumes that you're pulling together. We've talked about those early initial sort of iteration of Action Force, how that evolved into a narrative where we had Action Force, Z Force, Space Force, SAS Force, Q Force versus the Red Shadows, and how that became the core stories going through the Action Force narrative. What's really interesting is that partway through that narrative, that comic's lifespan, it takes a very interesting turn. And this might kind of slightly baffle some of our international viewers, in that the Action Force and Baron Ironblood, the Red Shadows, who are the bad guys, it takes a turn and it evolves into something that people will, certainly on the US side, be really familiar with. Effectively kind of turns into G.I. Joe, but is still very Action Force with a connection to Action Force. Can you tell us a bit about what happened behind the scenes there? And will we see that evolution in the Treasury editions and that continuation of Action Force as it kind of becomes G.I. Joe, but by another name?
So I think so I love that we're kind of getting into this. What I would always say is, you have to treat the Action Force content as not really a G.I. Joe tie-in, because it's not a tie-in. It's completely separate. So we've got Baron Ironblood, we've got his Red Shadows. They're unique Palitoy characters. We have Z Force, SAS Force, Space Force, and Q Force, again, uniquely Palitoy. And while you might see a couple of characters that look like G.I. Joe characters or toys, they've no resemblance to them in the mythology. So if we take, for example, Red Laser is a really obvious one, where we know the toy is a repaint of a Cobra Commander figure, but there's it's nothing to do with Cobra Commander. He's a Red Shadow. He's a scientist. He is an expert in Japanese kind of martial weaponry, and he's devotedly loyal to Baron Ironblood. It's nothing to do with the G.I. Joe universe whatsoever. You take say Gung Ho in G.I. Joe, you'll see a character called Gaucho on the Z Force team. Again, he's got a physical resemblance to Gung Ho, but the character Gaucho is Spanish. He's a mechanic, and he's got like almost like superhuman strength. But again, no real connection to the G.I. Joe universe whatsoever. And my favorite is Red Jackal, where Palitoy took the Destro action figure, saw the silver head, and they immediately thought, that's a cyborg, not a guy in a mask. So they created effectively the Terminator, which is what Red Jackal is. He's kind of, he's more machine than man, and he's just a lethal psychopath. He's not an arms dealer. He's not a puppet master trying to pull the strings behind Cobra Commander's back. He's just a weapon, and Baron Ironblood points him in the direction he needs to go, and off he goes. So the universe is completely different to G.I. Joe in this kind of 83, 84 era. To kind of properly understand the emergence of lots more G.I. Joe characters and familiarity coming into the comics universe, you have to look at what's happening in the toy industry. So Palitoy was going through a major change in its kind of makeup. It was moving out of design and manufacture and moving into marketing, sales and distribution for the entire continent of Europe. So once it made that change, its design department was gone. They were all let go, but Action Force was still a hot property in the British market, and there was still a huge demand for more Action Force material. So what Palitoy did was it leaned into that license with Hasbro, and it said, okay, give us more of your product. But there was no longer a design team there to rethink what these characters, how they would change them, either through paint apps or through tooling changes or anything like that. So they just took it wholesale from Hasbro, because again, design was gone. They just took it as it was from Hasbro, but the comics universe had to retcon all of these new toys into the mythology. So they didn't throw out. They could have just done a simple reboot. They could have rebooted the whole thing, but they didn't. They retconned it in. So Baron Ironblood decides to reinvent himself after a whole series of failures. It's like, okay, I've got to ditch these Red Shadows. I'm going to start from scratch. And you get this masterpiece story from Jerry Finley Day called World Enemy Number 1, which describes exactly that process of this kind of building up a brand new organization from scratch, which is even more lethal and more powerful than his Red Shadows ever were. And Action Force then in turn have to expand their ranks to meet this new global threat. And that they hire a guy called Duke. And Duke has to bring in new recruits from all over the globe, get them trained up, and you start to see these familiar characters like Stalker, Scarlet, Ripcord, Airborne, and even Gung Ho makes his way into the ranks, at some point. So that's just so the toy changes in the toy industry are driving kind of a new phase in the comics universe.
And what's really interesting there, and I think we talked about this when we talked about the difference between, in the Treasury editions, the core narrative, the core story, and then hopefully a bit further down the line with future editions, these origin stories. So what they did in that retcon effort was to take, say, for a character like Flash or Recondo, or characters like Flash or Recondo, they reintroduced them as totally recognizable characters that audience would recognize, the G.I. Joe audience would recognize visually, but gave them new kind of backstories and origins to introduce them into this kind of evolved Action Force mythos. So I think, if I remember, Ripcord was very much maybe a Royal Green Jacket British soldier, British infantry soldier, if I remember. Recondo, I think, was an Australian soldier. So again, very recognisable, but
was Irish. Got to give Ripcord a shout out there for being Irish. He's a local hero here where I'm from.
So again, I can't remember. I think Duke possibly kept close to his G.I. Joe origins as a sort of American sort of infantry airborne soldier. So here in the cover of this comic from 1985, so Battle Action Force, but what we're seeing there is Duke in this kind of evolved version of Action Force. And something that I know is very close to the hearts of many Action Force fans. This vehicle here, let's just talk a little bit about the Robo Skull, which is very interesting to me because it's a vehicle that looks like, compared to other Action Force vehicles, it should have been one of those toys that was imported from the US G.I. Joe line. But in fact, it wasn't, was it? It was very much uniquely a kind of Palitoy toy. Is that right?
Absolutely. So Bob Breakin, the head designer at Palitoy, he designed the Robo Skull. It was one of the last design contributions that he and his team had before they were all let go. So that they were let go in 1984, and the Robo Skull was only released to market a couple of months before that. So, but the Robo Skull is probably the greatest vehicle ever designed. And I have to give a shout out to my project partner on this, Skeletron, who have designed the Robo Skull Mark II, which will be out later this year. And if you're not familiar with Skeletron and the Robo Skull Mark II, definitely get online, Google that, you'll find their website. They've really done justice to the original Robo Skull with this brand new iteration. But the Robo Skull was great. I mean, it really came to life in the comics, particularly, in that kind of Cobra Commander era. It probably got a lot more page time because obviously the writers needed time to write the stories. The artists needed time to illustrate the stories. So we see the Robo Skull show up a lot more in 1985 and 86, even though it came to market in kind of mid 84.
Okay. So let's keep it Treasury Edition focused, though. So we know we've got 3 volumes of Treasury Editions. As I've said before, those are focusing on the core narrative storyline that will evolve from the kind of Q-Force, SAS Force, Red Shadows narrative through World Enemy Number 1 into that kind of Baron Ironblood evolving into Cobra Commander, and then those familiar G.I. Joe characters. The books are being... or not the books, but the comics are being restored for this reprint Treasury Edition. So I guess the key question is, how on earth do we get hold of this amazing this set of Treasury Editions? How do we get them? How are they available? Are they available internationally? What do we do to get our hands on these things?
Well, right now, the only way... Well, the books are up for pre-order through the Total Toy Books website, so totaltoybooks.com, and on the home page you'll see a link. Will take you right through to the product page, and you can pre-order the books right now. And we have a special pre-order bundle deal. So if you order all 3 books, you get the 3 books for the price of 2. And that's a great price for these books. Or if you just want one particular book, if you just want those kind of the very first Red Shadow stories, you get volume 1. If you are interested in Z-Force, you could get volume 3. That's the Z-Force trilogy, which focuses on that particular team, all written and illustrated by the same team as well. So it's all Jerry Finley Day writing, all Vanyo Brothers artwork. And then volume 2 is maybe a good all-rounder. It's got a little bit of everything, but with a focus perhaps on the SAS Force. Probably got the majority of the page time in the comics, so they tend to be kind of spearheading the Action Force attacks against the Red Shadows. So you can get one volume if one volume is all you're after, but right now the bundle deal's 3 volumes for the price of 2, and that deal does come to an end on August 17th. So midnight, August 17th, that deal is going to close, and you can still pre-order after that date, but the 3 books for the price of 2, that won't be available beyond August 17th. You're certainly looking at other options for distribution, beyond the website. But I can't make any announcements about that just yet. So right now, really, the only way to be 100% that you can get those books is to pre-order through totaltoybooks.com.
So totaltoybooks.com, the early bird 3 volumes for the price of 2 up until August the 17th. Just tell us about the page count for each volume, and then also the size of the volumes as they compare to, let's say, a regular size kind of trade paperback or other kind of hardback treasury type editions that might be on the shelf.
I'm just going to reach behind me here, and I'll bring one of the books over. So here is one of the books. I mean, they're pretty big, so even me trying to fit it in to the shot here, it's a. I don't know the exact dimensions in millimeters, but I think it's 320 by 270 in millimeters. So it is oversized. If we just talk a little bit about the page count, so we're looking at 272 pages in volume 1. Volume 2 has 304 pages, and volume 3 has 272 pages as well. So there's a lot of pages in them. It is printed on a kind of a matte, uncoated paper, so it'll have the same look and feel as the original comics, but it's a much higher grade, kind of contemporary type paper. It'll be much more it'll have much more longevity. It was not going to degrade in 20 years, 30 years. Like it's what you would expect from a proper coffee table, high quality book. So, that's kind of the size and the page count, how it compares to other books. So there's, again, I'll just sit back. So there's kind of a typical trade paperback from Rebellion, like soft cover. And you can see that the Battle Action Force Treasury Edition is a lot, it's significantly bigger.
Wow.
So these are...
So I was going to say, jumping on that early bird offer before August the 17th, I think is a must-do for people that want to get all 3 volumes.
So if I kind of break that down, give a quick breakdown of the price. The prices on the website are quoted in euro, but if you go for that bundle deal and you're in, say, Britain, that's about £40 per book. Just maybe £41, £42 per book on that bundle deal, which is a fantastic price given what you're getting. If you're in the United States, that's probably more like $55 a book, $60 a book. I'm just converting in my head here. And then euro wise, it's less than €50 a book for people in the Eurozone. So that bundle deal is a fantastic price for anyone who's thinking of going all in for the 3 volumes. So, and then shipping, because the books are heavy. So we have a great shipping partner here in Ireland. So we can do shipping to the UK is about, I'm going to say I think it's €16 to ship to the UK. So that might only be like £12 to £14 for shipping. And then Skeletron are going to help us with our North American fulfillment. So we can ship the books in America for about €25. That's maybe $30. That's for the 3 books together, which is about £15 in weight or 7 kilos.
And that's amazing value. I mean, shipping, I know, is always a contentious thing, especially when shipping books from one country to another. By comparison, I looked at a book, an art book, a nice coffee table art book I was considering buying this week. And the cost of the shipping was higher than the actual book itself. So the shipping that you've just quoted there is an absolute bargain.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things I've been working on. For all the books that Total Toy Books have produced, shipping is always shipping costs, trying to get them down, and it's finding the right kind of partners to work with that can give a safe and reliable service, but also get the cost down. So we're in a really good place with this particular project. I think we've got some great shipping prices. Now, for people who are maybe in Australia, New Zealand, or kind of Asia, it is going to be expensive to ship to those destinations from Ireland. It's going to be very expensive. But I'm always on the hunt for kind of a better kind of shipping partner for those particular zones. So if we manage to track one down, people will know through our socials, or if they follow us, on our mailing list, but we can always let people know, and we will pass on any savings for those kind of what I call far away destinations, or the rest of the world's destinations. But in terms of Britain, Ireland, Europe, North America, which is where the bulk of our readers really are anyway, we've got that superb shipping rates already locked in, which is great.
That's amazing. And then, so we know August 17th for the early bird cut-off. After that, the books will only be available as they're 3 separate volumes as opposed to buy 2, get 1 free. That will be available from totaltoybooks.com, is that right?
Correct, yes.
Yeah. Mike, a question that's kind of come up in my mind, 2 questions for you. The first one is, will there be any kind of digital editions of these available later on? Because for those of us with failing eyesight, we like to read on iPads and digital platforms. Are there any plans to see these released in a digital format at all?
The Total Toy Books license is only for the Treasury Edition books, so the license doesn't cover any other format other than the Treasury Edition format. But what I would say, you mentioned about the eyesight there, because these are larger in format than how they were originally printed, everything's scaled up by 15%. So that makes the reading is going to make it be a little bit easier on the eye. But plus, if you just for people who just want to look at the artwork, it's beautifully presented in that kind of oversized format.
Absolutely. And then my other question is, and I know the answer to this, but I'm sure anybody watching this, especially those people familiar with G.I. Joe and later iterations of Action Force, your license is for the IPC iteration of Action Force that kind of covered Action Force, as we've talked about, Q-Force, the Red Shadows, that evolution into that version of Action Force. But as we know, there was a version of Action Force, which again was another reinterpretation of G.I. Joe, that was printed by Marvel UK later on. That's something that's outside of the ambitions of what you're doing here with the Treasury editions. Is that right?
So that is, yeah. So that's a separate kind of body of work. That would need completely different licenses to be able to reproduce that. It's something I would love to do, but it wouldn't be covered under the remit of the existing license. But I love it again that you brought that up, because the Marvel UK Action Force is a comic that I read as well. That's growing up, and again you kind of have to look at changes in the toy scene to kind of to figure out what was happening there. So we talked earlier about how Palitoy shifted from design and manufacture into marketing and distribution. Well, another change was that they were going to stop doing any kind of licenses. They weren't going to license in new toys from competitor companies anymore. So once that decision was made, remember Action Force by 1986 was entirely licensed from Hasbro at this stage. So once they made a decision to kind of cancel all licenses, that license went back to Hasbro. And with that went the Action Force trademark that went back to Hasbro as well in 1986. And of course, what happens then after that is that the Action Force ends in battle. So IPC lost the contract to do the Action Force stories, and that contract moved to Marvel UK. And this is where we see a reboot. The Action Force universe gets completely rebooted and dovetails in with what Larry Hama and Marvel were doing in the USA. So in 1987, I think it was March 1987, we get this brand new Action Force comic. The front cover features Flint, Lady J, and Footloose, who would be the principal characters in this new British version of Action Force. And I think even that first issue explains that Action Force is the European base of operations or code name of operations for G.I. Joe. It's G.I. Joe in America, it's Action Force in Europe. And they set that up in the continuity in the Marvel UK runs, like straight out the door. But it's a complete reboot. It's not connected to anything that IPC had done or that Palitoy had done. And they were specifically, Marvel UK were specifically told by Hasbro, use these characters because they're not being featured as heavily in the comics in America. So Hasbro were able to give a very kind of prescriptive is not the right term, but a very clear brief in terms of which characters to use and how they could use them. And you even find that Destro is more the bad guy, even though Cobra Commander's there in the comics universe in Marvel UK, but Destro is really the main bad guy. He's the arch nemesis for Action Force in that kind of initial run. And that comic ran, it was a weekly in traditional British comic format. It was an issue every week. I think they got 50 issues of the weekly comic, and then they moved it into more of an American format. The size changed to the American comic size, and it went to a monthly run then. And those monthly comics were reprinted in the States as G.I. Joe European Missions. But I don't believe the weekly comics that the original content from the weekly comics was ever reprinted.
I don't think it was it? And that's quite interesting, because what you saw in those comics were, it was interesting how it paralleled in places Transformers, and how, because UK comics were weekly, so the IPC Battle Action Force was a weekly comic, and then of course, as we're talking about the Marvel UK comic, it was weekly, whereas US comics were monthly. And if I remember with Transformers, I think Simon Furman told me this, they very quickly ran out of US content because they were publishing so much quicker than the Americans were. So that's why they had to start to produce UK originated content. So the Marvel UK comics is really interesting, because what you've got is UK originated content by well-known people such as Simon Furman, Kev Hopgood. You've got Brian Hitch making his kind of very early comic book appearances there, producing art when he was like 17 or something, and still at school. Yeah. So some real sort of UK superstars were starting to emerge there. But what they were also doing was reprinting some US content. And I'm sure Simon Furman told me that they had to, when they would get the whatever format they received the US pages to reprint in the UK, they would have to go through and by hand kind of change any reference to G.I. Joe to Action Force. So it matched the UK continuity. Eventually they just gave up and were just like, this is too much effort. Let's just call it G.I. Joe and recognise that. But as they were reprinting the US content, there was a connection between what was happening in that UK content, and they were trying to retcon it, weren't they? There was kind of, I think they started off with, I don't know, I think it was like Storm Shadow being released from jail with the after the issue 21 or something like that, wasn't it? With the US content they were reprinting, but trying to make it match the UK original stuff. It was hard work to follow, but some of the work was amazing.
We got to interview for Total Action Force Volume 2, a book that was published by Total Toy Books back in 2022. We got to interview Rich Starkings, who was the editor on the Marvel UK's Action Force comic, and the weekly comic. So he gave us he was a brilliant person to speak to, and he was able to give us a lot of detail on that kind of setup of Action Force at Marvel UK. And what Rich, what he let us know was that he was given, I think, 70 issues of Larry Hama's comic, which he had to read in a weekend. And then he had to, from there, build his plan for new Action Force content. So he knew this stuff from Larry Hama, it's too good to not include. So we're going to reprint some of this content, and then we're going to create our own new content and the two will kind of sit side by side in the comic, and and then the plan or the intention is that they would kind of feed into each other. So that it would feel, for British readers and Irish readers, it would feel it was all part of the same universe. So yeah, you talk about where they had to change G.I. Joe to Action Force in the reprinted pages. They had to do that, and then the storylines they were creating in the with the new content couldn't contradict anything that was being reprinted, and in some cases had to weave in. But here's an interesting one. The Marvel UK did reprint the classic silent issue, but they made changes to the artwork to link that in with some of the continuity that was being set up with the new British content. So one of those changes is that when Destro is looking at the chessboard, I think he picks up the Baroness figure. In the original printing, in the British version of that, he picks up the Storm Shadow figure, because that ties in then later with a Storm Shadow storyline that comes after that. So there was a kind of a bit of cross pollination kind of going both ways. But bringing that back to what we were talking about much earlier on, it's easy to, looking at the Marvel UK universe, it's easy for people, say, not from Britain and Ireland, to think that Action Force is just a European variant of G.I. Joe, because that's essentially what it was when it was at Marvel UK. But really its roots go back a couple of years into this totally original, totally unique toy line with its own mythology, its own characters. It's, and I suppose that's kind of the legacy that I'm trying to preserve with these new volumes that are coming out this year.
And it's interesting because to see that origin and to see a totally unique yet brilliant take on those familiar G.I. Joe characters, you only need to look at the volumes that you've been producing and restoring in these treasury editions. And I think if this was to happen today, we'd be calling it a multiverse, wouldn't we? And there would be some sort of connectivity and that kind of stuff in this world of multiverses. But in the multiverse of the early 1980s, before such a word existed, we absolutely had the evolution from the Red Shadows to Cobra in the pages of IPC's Action Force, as captured in the Action Force 3-volume Treasury editions, available from TotalToyBooks.com. I think that's a really good spot to wrap it up there, Brian, because I appreciate we've been talking for a while. It's been absolutely fascinating talking to you, and I wish you every success for this project. There will be undoubtedly some text along here, some pictures up here somewhere, showing people how and where they can get the books and links and things like that. August the 17th is your cut-off to get those 3 volumes for the price of 2. After that, it's 3 volumes at their individual prices. Anything that we haven't talked about, Brian, that you would like to sort of get across to the audience today about the project?
I think we've been pretty comprehensive there. We've kind of covered a lot of stuff about that. I mean, I would just kind of recap it by saying that these 3 volumes just cover the Baron Ironblood, Red Shadows kind of era of Action Force. So it doesn't get into the Cobra era of Action Force. But the ambition is there to certainly do additional volumes, but anything beyond these 3 is obviously subject to license or approval. So I can't really kind of comment on any of that right now. But the big focus is getting these books. They're going to print in later this year. The plan is to have them shipped out to anyone who's pre-ordered, shipped out by December, or in December. They'll be shipping out to anyone who's pre-ordered. So how that's going to work is that I've got a fulfillment centre here in Ireland, so that's going to handle the British, European, and kind of the rest of world kind of regions that we talked about, and then the North American fulfillment will happen on the Skeletron, and their fulfillment kind of partner will handle the North American fulfillment. At that time, I would say the North American books might go out maybe a week later than the Ireland, Britain, Europe, because they're just going to have to clear customs before we can get them into the distribution centre. But they'll be hot on the heels of everybody else. Like, those books will be out there. So we're hopeful we can get books into people's hands, by Christmas time. Obviously, I can't promise that that's going to be the case, because it's going to be a very busy time with shipping companies all over the world. But certainly that is what we're going to do our damnedest to try and get those books into your hands, in time for Christmas. And I think that will be a fantastic Christmas gift to yourself, or to that person in your life who's an Action Force fan.
Absolutely. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to end the interview there. I'll press stop, and then we'll just say our goodbyes after. But Brian, can't thank you enough. Folks, check this out. Like Brian, a lifelong Action Force fan. You can see original art on the walls there from Action Force, and G.I. Joe figures there. I am so excited for this project, and I know you will be too. I've seen some teasers of the pages. You will have seen them appearing on the screen here, and here. Please do check it out and support this great project, especially if you want to see those future volumes that maybe could come about in the future. The gateway to that is through these first 3 volumes and supporting this project. Brian, thank you ever so much for your time.
Thank you, Russ. My pleasure.